Welcome back to our series on the intimacy of God in St. Thomas Aquinas. The Scottish Episcopal Institute is presenting this four-part series, and this is the second part of that series, where Dr. Grant will speak to us about God and creation.
Thank you very much. So we get to it this time, but I want to start with an amusing little story from Thomas's life. And the story is that he was an irritating small child. His life is surrounded with a number of stories. Probably a good number of them are legendary. This one has something of the scent of legend about it, but who knows? The story goes that he was a slightly irritating child who would irritate everyone around him. He would annoy his whole family by continuously asking them what God was. Okay, so he would go around asking people, what is God? And he would keep doing that because he found that each time he asked someone, he wouldn't get a good answer. I actually found this story quite charming, I admit. But the point of the story is that in an important sense, we can't give a good answer. We can answer the question, who is God? But what is God remains something unknown to us. Okay, so I mentioned in the last talk that probably the greatest work of St. Thomas's academic career, the greatest work of his life, the one that he leaves unfinished when he has the mystical experience, is the Summa Theologiae, the summary of theology, which is divided into three parts, although the second part itself is divided into two parts. So we have the first part of the second part, the second part of the second part, and the third part. So three parts, which are actually four parts. But the first part of the Summa is in many ways, in large part, about that question, what is God, and why is it that we can't answer it? And if we were to read together the first part of the Summa, it would seem that Thomas has quite a lot to say about God, despite saying that we can't know who God is. So our first question is, how does that work? So let's start with an important distinction. For Thomas, the Bible tells us very clearly who God is. God is the Holy Trinity. God is the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. But what God is a different question. That remains unknown. And to talk about why, I'm afraid we're going to have a little bit of Aristotle today. Okay. There is at most one piece of technical Aristotelian distinction-mongering and vocabulary per talk. But today's is quite important and quite fundamental. It's the distinction between act and potency. Act and potency are two principles which underlie everything, every created thing that exists. Okay, so what does that mean? I'm sure that's clear as mud. Right. Act is actuality. Act is what something is in reality. Act is the being of a thing. So here I am in act. I am actually human. I am actually so tall, so bearded, so red-haired, so dressed, so many other things. Okay, and all of that's reasonably simple and straightforward. If you see what something is, if you see that it is something, or that you see that it is in a certain way, then what you are encountering is its actuality. It's being such and such a thing in act. Potency is the tough one, because potency is the ground of possibility. But the thing is that possibilities here aren't just abstract options. Potency is in some way also a qualification of the being of a thing. So I have the potency, here I am talking to you reasonably soberly, but I have the potency to wave my arms around in a crazy manner while I speak to you. Or I am in potency to giving you this lecture lying on my back on the floor. And if you were second-year students, I would actually do that because it wakes them up in an afternoon. But potency is all of the things. It's rooted in act. Okay, so potency needs real being to be grounding it. But it's all the ways in which something which is real has a capacity to change or be otherwise than it is. Okay, so I am actually a living human being, but I'm a mortal living human being. That is to say, I am in potency to ceasing to live, to becoming something else, to becoming, in fact, a corpse, right? So, act is what's real, and potency is the way in which something which is real is capable of becoming otherwise than it is, either turning into something completely different or changing the way in which it is the thing that it is. And for this way of understanding reality, all of us, all creatures, all limited and finite things are in some way combinations or compositions of these two principles. To be a human being in act is to have certain potencies. That mortality, for example, is just a potency for undergoing various things which would deprive me of life. Likewise, when I was younger and clean-shaven, my potency to grow a beard was one of the limitations on my actuality. It was, if you like, the boundary of my being. Potency is, as it were, the boundary of the way that something is, the boundary which defines the directions in which it can go and keeps its actuality limited to being some particular real thing. Okay. And what that means is that when we change, when we alter in some respect, whether that's moving around in space or growing taller or shaving or whatever the case may be, we are reducing or leading back potency to act. In other words, what was previously potential, let's say my potential to become clean-shaven again, becomes actual by some change that's made in the world. Okay. Now, changes can only be made by actual things. Everything, this is a great scholastic claim, everything which is moved or changed is moved or changed by something else. So all potencies are actualized by some actuality, because only the actualities are real in a full sense. So in order for a potency to be actualized, to be reduced to act, some act has to be there first. Okay, so there's a primacy of act over potency. Now, if you get all that into your head, okay, and you watch it back at 2.5 speed, and I'm sure it will be even less clear when you do, right? But if you can get all that into your head, then Thomas's arguments for the existence of God, famously he offers 5, at least the first 3, and particularly the first one, are all based on this principle, that everything which is moved by something else, understanding moving in terms of reducing potency to act. Okay. But because there's a primacy of act over potency, because act has to come first, and also because there can't be, he thinks, an infinite regress, when we get all the way back to the beginning of the chain of motions, and this isn't necessarily back to the temporal beginning, but you might want to think of this, if you think of the time as a sort of horizontal timeline, you might want to think of these movers as stacked up vertically, say. When we get to the highest possible mover, so the first mover is not necessarily the one at time 0, but the highest possible mover, there can be no potency left. We can only have act. This is pure act. And this is in something like Thomas's definition of God. But it's not a definition, because if we have pure act, we've got something with no limits. And a comparison, a definition always takes something like the form of a comparison. It's always showing the way in which one thing is limited in a different way to the way in which something else is limited. So when we've thought our way all the way up to God, for when Thomas has reached pure act, he says, this all men, this everyone, understands to be God. We've got something wholly unlimited and wholly beyond definition. So this is the natural theology that Mike and I were talking about in the conversation at the end of the last talk. It's an open question whether Thomas thinks that, well, I come down on one side of this question. I think Thomas thinks Aristotle knew this, and I think he thinks it's basically just philosophy. Others will disagree whether you have to be, properly speaking, a theologian to have recognized God from this. But you get back to a God, you can know that God is. You can even know that God is unlike everything else, because God is pure act, where everything else is some sort of composition of act and potency. And God himself can tell us who he is. He has told us who he is. But we can't grasp what God is. God, by virtue of being unlimited, always exceeds and goes beyond our grasp. One qualification for that, which is, we need to remember that when we're talking about not like anything else, there are different ways in which things are not like each other. I'm not much like this lectern in various ways. You know, I've got a different height. I'm not made of wood, thankfully. I'm a real lecturer, all sorts of things. But all of those are comparisons of our different limitations. If you want, we could have a sort of scale of being with lecterns at one end, you know, not alive, boring, made of wood, actually quite beautifully carved. So plus point for lecterns there compared to me, all right? And me, a living human being on the other end. And the comparison between us is a sort of scale. And we might want to say we can project sort of being all the way down to rocks and stones and the lowest and least interesting possible things. And maybe we can project all the way in the other direction up to the highest of the archangels and say those are the most different things that they could possibly be. God still would not be at one end of that scale. God is off the scale entirely. So pure act is not just the most act. Pure act is the foundation for everything else in a way that is not like anything else, but is not different from anything else in the way that things are different from each other. Okay. We'll try and talk about why that's important and interesting and helpful by talking about creation. Okay. Because this is the root of divine intimacy for Thomas. Okay. So creation, a pretty standard Christian doctrine. I think we confess God as the maker of heaven and earth in the Creed. It's, I think, a well-known, standard, traditional Christian teaching that the world is made, that the universe, that creation is made from nothing. That's not to say, that, of course, that nothing is, as it were, a sort of type of material which has been somehow arranged into the world. That would be senseless. What it means is that the world is not made from anything. Okay. But that creates a little bit of a problem about this word made. Okay. If I were to make something like this lectern, which I would do not nearly so good a job on, I would have to make it from something. I would have to make it out of wood. Even if I were to make something quite abstract, let's say I were to somehow make up a new story or a new mathematical theorem, there would be something on which I was working to do that. There would be some sort of substrate, some sort of thing that was already there that I was somehow transforming to get this new thing out of it. Okay. But that isn't true for creation. So while God is the maker of heaven and earth, it's not really a sort of making like the one that we come across in any part of our lives. And this distinction of act and potency offers us a clue or a way of thinking about why that is. So we've got God. God, pure act, no potency at all. None of these limitations that are the edges, as it were, of the actuality of particular created beings. And if there's no potency at all, God can't get to be more act. God can't get to be more God than God already is. God is always infinitely God, as much God as it's possible to be. So God doesn't change. But there's another side to having no potency, which means that there isn't some sort of set of prior possibilities for creation which are out there independently of God. In later theological history, some people will imagine things like this. Leibniz, for example, that somehow God, we can imagine God surrounded by the infinite sea of possible created things, and he picks the one that he wants to make real. But for Thomas, God is not choosing from a set of possibilities. It's not the case in some sense. In some sense, we could say that before God creates, creation is not possible, not even possible. It's only by an infinite power that God makes what is not to be out of nothing. And he does that, on this way of thinking, by contracting actuality by potency. So we don't end up with more actuality. We end up with something like a shrinking down to a way of being that is not quite as grand as God's, right? And that means that creation doesn't add more being to God. Instead, this is a Platonic term, we participate in God. That means that we receive from God in our own way, in a sort of reduced but nevertheless fully real way, a reflection or imitation of God's being. It's not ideal that I've talked about reduction or shrinking here, because that implies that in some sense we are less than we could be, less than we ought to be. That's not the case at all. It's just that to be a creature is to be in some limited and finite way, and that doesn't sum up, that doesn't add up in a sum with God's infinity. There's not more reality there than when there was just God. But there is, for us, this finite and limited way of existing. So creation is not a making, but Thomas uses the term an emanation, a putting out of all being from the universal cause. Another way, if you like, of thinking about this is that creation is not something additional to God, because God and creation exist on different levels. We're not in the realm of pure act. We are, as it were, down here in the realm of act and potency, and that level works differently to the divine one. Okay, so I promised that I was here to talk about the intimacy of God, and I've just spent, looking at my timer, maybe about 5 minutes, telling you about how we are reduced from God, less than God, and in some sense don't even add up with God in the same sum. Okay, so how are we going to work that through? The non-summative, the fact that God and creatures don't add up, also leads to, and I'm going to quote from Euan Williams here, to the idea that what we have in creation is not, as it were, God achieving some goal. There's not some lack that God needs to make up. There's not something that God needs from us. Instead, simply because we're on different levels, creation is in every respect a gift. There's nothing that God needs to hold back, and there's nothing that God needs to work out or work through. We are not here, as it were, to fill up some sort of psychological need for God that God has somehow failed to make up for himself in the land of the Trinity. No. Precisely because God and creation are on different levels, the level of creation is in every respect a gift, a free thing. And the Euan Williams thought that I want to draw on here is that God does not therefore take up space. If we live freely, that's not taking away from God's prerogatives in the world in some way. Our freedom and God's freedom don't clash. Because we're on different levels, God can make us more free rather than take our freedom from us by acting. And also that means that God is not far away from us rather than close to us. being on different levels isn't actually a sort of spatial gap. If it were to be on the same level, is to have the possibility of being divided. I am, in a sense, on the same level here as my lectern, because we are here in a coordinated 3D space. So I can move closer, and I can move further away. But with God, precisely because God isn't competing for space with us, precisely because there's no particular place where God is, that means also, and precisely because everything has to be received immediately from God, so there's no getting being except by this gift from God. That means that God, while being infinitely high, if you like, is also infinitely close. There's no division, and there's no separation. God is not on a different level because he's the opposite of everything, but rather God is on the different level because he's not the opposite of anything. He's the fullness from which everything is drawn in its own sort of limited way. So God, and then here Thomas draws on St. Augustine, God is everywhere and completely everywhere, by essence, by knowledge, and by power, since nothing can be except when God continually gives it this free gift of being, a gift of being which is a reflection in its own way of his being. And so even to exist at all, for rocks and stones, way down there at the bottom end of the scale of beings, if you like, to exist at all is a sort of closeness to God, because God, as infinitely high, is also infinitely close. So the interesting and difficult thing here, and maybe I'll manage to make this more intuitive in the next few talks as well, is that being this close, being absolutely close, relies on being also completely high and completely different. So different that the ordinary differences between things no longer matter or make sense. And there's a phrase, I'm not quite sure whose phrase this is first, is that God, it's a popular phrase among contemporary theologians, God differs differently. It is because God is not like us, for Thomas, that God can be not only quite close to us, but absolutely close to us. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we are as close to God as we could be. God is already as close to us as he can get. But God wants to bring us closer to him and make us more like him. And that is the subject for our next talk.
Euan, thanks very much for your second talk and for all the explanation of these technical terms that we use to describe God. Again, it brings me back a bit to my own education and my own time studying philosophy. And back in those days, we spoke Latin, you see, so...
Better days.
And what came to my mind was the distinction between the way in which we make or craft things, or we might say create things, and the way in which God makes or creates things. So we used to speak about the creatio ex nihilo, creation from nothing, how God creates from nothing, and then of course how we describe ourselves oftentimes, particularly in terms of children, as procreators. Maybe you could unpack the similarities and the differences to sort of highlight the intimacy that exists between us and God in creating things.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, the way I've taken it in the talk, and I think this is baseline and fundamental for Aquinas, is that there is an absolute, at the end, there's an absolute distinction. And actually that's one of the reasons why, or that's connected to the fact that for Aquinas, of course, God individually creates each human soul. So there's with the procreative element, with human reproduction, there is a sense in which each person is an individual act of creation, which is quite significant, really. You know, that's worth thinking about, I think. And then, of course, there's this question of creativity. Is divine creativity like human creativity? And there are some strong, slightly wacky readings of Aquinas where those are really drawn together in a very strong way. I'm not a big fan of them, but I think probably a slightly different Aristotelian Thomist term which would help us there is form. So I'm not going to do a disquisition on form and matter. In fact, there are going to be some more terms, but they're going to be simpler, I hope, for the next couple of talks. But in some sense, creation is giving something form, giving it its shape, its identity, and if you like a Latin tag here, forma dat esse, form gives being. And while when we form things, we never form them absolutely. We never give being simply speaking, because being simply speaking is always the divine gift, always that immediate divine gift. And that's the absolute distinction between creation and creativity of any sort, mechanical, artistic, biological. Nevertheless, we do, and God does work with us in an important sense in giving form, so that when we, this is part of Thomas's sense that the world is not, while everything is held in being by God immediately, that doesn't mean that there are no causal links, no real changes being made by creatures. Some of the great Islamic Aristotelian thinkers thought that basically causation was an illusion, except coming from God to creatures. But for Thomas, because we've got these two levels, being down here, as it were, has a sort of integrity, and we can really give form to things. We can really, in that sense, exercise creativity such that new things come to be in the world, not in a way where we're competing with God, but in a way in which, like I said, our freedom is something which is liberated by God's activity, so that we are cooperating with God in a creative way by bringing new forms into reality. Is that
No, it's very interesting, and it also calls to mind in another set of Latin terms God's. Well, in English we would say God's being and his essence, or his esse et essentia, as they say in Latin, and how for us they're not the same thing. For human beings, they're not the same thing. They are the same for God. And I wonder maybe if you can unpack that a bit, or help us sort of understand how that relates to our own being and essence, which are not the same.
Yeah, maybe that might be helpful for some people. That might perhaps be more helpful than thinking in terms of act and potency, because here we have another way in which God is, as it were, purely one term, where in creatures we have this division. So, essentia, essence. The essence is what something is. The definition, if you like, of something. So, and then the esse, which is the sort of, that's the Latin for to be, really, uses a noun, as you'll know. And yes, in creatures, what we see, according to Thomas, is that everything is a composite of these two as well. So there is something there is a sort of energy of existence, if you want to put it like that, which I have to receive, which is not simply reducible to my humanness. Yes, energy is the sort of, it's a metaphor here that we're reaching for, because, and here I am following a slightly different school of Thomas interpretation, whatever. To be is not reducible to any set of facts about something. So in some sense, maybe our human essence is the sort of basic set of facts which are true of all human beings, and then we have additional things that are true of all of us in different ways, our height or our weight or whatever, whereas we all share our essential humanity. But But to be real is something deeper and further than that. So there's an additional gift of being which is not contained simply within that common humanity. So I could not be without being a human being, but human beingness does not imply existence. The difference for God, of course, being that Godness and the act of existing, the energy of divine existence, are not differentiated, are not separated. So for God to be God simply is for God to be. And so what we have, as well as pure act, actus purus, we have the idea that God is ipsum esse subsistens, which is to be or being itself existing. And I think the way in which that might be helpful is this gives us perhaps a better idea of what it means to be participating in God. It's not just that God is, as it were, the pattern of everything, held together in one, rather than spread out, but really the act of existing at all, the energy of existence, if you like, is entire and complete in God, so that we have this subsistent, this existing esse, and it's not just as, that sort of humanness images God in one way and bovineness images God in another, and so on and so forth. That's all true, Thomas thinks. So to be a particular sort of thing is always to be a sort of image of the divine essence, a limited one. But also that those images require this gift of being as such, which is participated from being as such, being with a capital B, being itself truly existing, which is God, the unity of essence and existence. And perhaps that's more helpful than pure act for some people.
Definitely, and it touches too upon intimacy in the sense that if we think of God as creator, and creatures long for their creator, if you think of God, as you said, not only in creating the world and everything in it, not only in an act of love and creating, if you will, the environment in which we find ourselves, but also in the act of love and the individual creation of human beings. Because in fact, the world came into being and is held in being by God. In Him we live and move and have our being.
Exactly.
But at a certain point in time, even though all time is present to God, but in time as we know it, God creates each one of us individually and puts us, if you will, and this isn't the best philosophical language, but puts us in the trajectory of Himself in the sense, of course, God's not going anywhere, is it? It's on its way anywhere. The prime mover is not moved. So there's no past or future for God, but there is a future for us. Yeah. And the future that we look toward is to be in His presence, literally in terms of the physical presence, if you will. I mean, not His physical presence, but presence in that way, but also in presence, in the sense of just enjoying this beatific vision. So, again, in a present time. So, I don't know, for me, the intimacy that we enjoy in God takes us, into this ongoing activity of God in creating us, in redeeming us, and loving us, and then giving us this opportunity to spend eternity, whatever eternity may be, with Him in an intimacy that is only something we kind of scratch at now. But certainly, I think Thomas helps us in our scratch.
I hope
that
so.
makes any sense.
I think so. Well, I think maybe we should talk about eternity after the next talk, because what you said is basically the perfect trailer for the next one.
Fantastic.
So let's keep eternity in reserve and see if we return to that.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Ian.
Thank you.